A racist officer thought he was just arresting another black child, but he had no idea the little girl was the captain's daughter. Officer Derek Mason had a reputation, one that wasn't hidden beneath the surface. Everyone knew him as the cop who consistently found reasons to harass black residents in the quiet town of Brooksville. He was the kind of officer who believed he had authority over everyone, especially those he considered beneath him, particularly people like Keisha. It was a hot afternoon when Mason spotted the 8-year-old black girl playing by herself in the park. Keisha, with her curly braids bouncing as she skipped through the grass, was simply enjoying her day. But in Mason's eyes, that was reason enough for suspicion. He pulled up in his squad car, eyes narrowing as he watched her from behind the wheel. Mason had never seen her before, but that didn't matter. As he stepped out of the car, his voice barked with authority. "Hey, what are you doing here? You know this isn't a playground for loitering." Keisha froze, the joy of her playtime quickly draining from her face. Her wide eyes turned to him, her small hands clutching the toy she had been playing with. "I'm just playing," she said, her voice soft but clear. "Playing, huh?" Mason sneered, his hand already on the belt where his handcuffs rested. "You're too old to be messing around like that in a public park without supervision. You should know better." Keisha blinked, confusion mixing with the fear now rising inside her. "My dad, he works with the police," she offered quietly, trying to defuse the tension. "I'm allowed to be here." But Mason wasn't listening. His gaze, cold and dismissive, zeroed in on her skin color, his bias blinding him to any reason. "Sure he does," he scoffed, as if the idea of a black man working in law enforcement was a joke. "You're coming with me." Keisha's heart raced, panic setting in as Mason grabbed her wrist. "Wait, I'm telling the truth. My dad is Captain Allen. He's the police captain. Please don't—" "Captain Allen?" Mason stopped, but only for a moment. His lips curled into a smirk. "Sure he is. That's a nice lie, kid. Let's go." With a click, the cold metal of the handcuffs snapped around her tiny wrists. Keisha started to cry, her pleas falling on deaf ears as Mason pushed her into the back of his squad car. The park had been empty, and no one was there to witness the gross abuse of power. As the car sped toward the station, Keisha could only wonder why the officer wouldn't believe her. She'd seen her dad walk through those very doors 100 times, but now, with each passing second, her fear grew. Surely her father would come, wouldn't he? Keisha sat in the back of the squad car, her wrists aching from the too tight cuffs. Tears streamed down her face as the streets of Brooksville blurred past her window. She kept thinking of her dad, Captain Allen, and how everything would be fine once he knew. He'd make this stop, right? He always did. Officer Mason glanced at her through the rearview mirror, his eyes cold and indifferent. He felt a twisted sense of satisfaction. This was just another lesson for the town's black residents. They needed to know who was in charge. "You people never learn, do you?" he muttered under his breath, loud enough for Keisha to hear. Keisha didn't respond, her small body trembling with a mix of fear and anger. "Why won't he believe me?" she thought. "Daddy will fix this. He has to." When they pulled up at the station, Mason wasted no time dragging her out of the car. Keisha, still in shock, stumbled as he led her inside, his grip unrelenting. The other officers in the station looked up, their faces showing signs of confusion and unease. They were used to Mason's antics, but something didn't sit right with them this time. An 8-year-old in cuffs? That was low even for him. "Got a little troublemaker here," Mason announced loudly as he pushed Keisha toward the booking area. His voice carried an air of triumph, as if he'd just caught a dangerous criminal. "Caught her loitering in the park?" Officer Ramirez, a colleague of Mason's, frowned as she approached. "Derek, what are you doing? She's just a kid. You can't seriously be booking her." Mason waved her off. "Rules are rules. She was where she wasn't supposed to be, and I'm taking her in. Don't worry about it." Ramirez crouched down to meet Keisha's eyes, her tone softening. "Sweetie, are you okay? What's your name?" Keisha sniffled, her voice shaky as she answered. "My name's Keisha. My dad is Captain Allen. Please, I didn't do anything wrong. He's going to be so mad when he finds out." Ramirez's eyes widened. "Wait, Captain Allen? As in our Captain Allen?" She shot a glance at Mason, who simply shrugged, unfazed. Yeah, that's what she says, Mason said dismissively. Kid's just trying to talk her way out of this. I'm not falling for it. But Ramirez wasn't so sure. You're serious, Derek? You cuffed the captain's daughter? Mason rolled his eyes, clearly growing impatient. I told you she's lying. I don't care whose daughter she claims to be. She's black. She's in the wrong place, and I'm handling it. The air in the station grew tense. Ramirez stood up, her hands balling into fists as she stepped back. I really think you should double-check that. Mason scoffed. There's no need. Let's get her processed. But before Mason could take another step, the door to the station burst open. In strode Captain Allen, his face a mask of fury. His eyes immediately found Keisha, her wrists still shackled in Mason's cuffs. His chest tightened as the realization hit him like a ton of bricks. What the hell is going on here? He thundered. Captain Allen's voice cut through the station like a bolt of lightning. The room froze, every officer turning to look at him. His usually calm demeanor was nowhere to be found. He was seething with rage. His gaze locked on Keisha, still in handcuffs, her tear-streaked face a testament to the nightmare she'd just endured. Keisha's eyes lit up with relief. Daddy, she cried, her voice shaking as she ran toward him. But the handcuffs held her back, causing her to stumble. In an instant, Captain Allen was by her side. He knelt down, cradling her in his arms before quickly removing the cuffs. Are you okay, baby girl? He asked, his voice softening for only a moment. Keisha nodded through her tears, her small body trembling against him. But as soon as Captain Allen stood up, his fury returned tenfold. He turned toward Officer Mason, eyes blazing. What the hell is this? Why is my daughter in handcuffs, Derek? Mason, who had never seen the captain so furious, tried to regain his composure. Sir, I didn't know she was your daughter. I was just doing my job. She was alone in the park, and I thought... You thought what? Captain Allen's voice rose, cutting off any excuse Mason tried to make. You thought a little black girl playing in a park was a threat? That she was some kind of criminal? Mason stammered, suddenly feeling the weight of his actions. She said she was your daughter, but I didn't believe her. Kids lie all the time. I thought she was just making it up. You thought, Allen growled, taking a step forward, that because she's black, she had to be lying. Is that it, Derek? Mason's throat went dry. He could feel the eyes of the entire station on him now, and the truth he'd always tried to hide was glaringly obvious. No, sir, it's not like that. Then what is it like? Captain Allen cut in, his voice low but dangerously controlled. You didn't even bother to check. You didn't think for a second that she might actually be telling the truth. You just saw a black child and decided to slap handcuffs on her. The silence in the station was suffocating. The other officer stood back, unsure of what to do or say. Officer Ramirez, still nearby, crossed her arms, her expression a mix of anger and disbelief. I've been dealing with complaints about you for months, Derek, Allen continued, his voice steady with restrained fury. But this is personal. You handcuffed my daughter, my 8-year-old daughter, for no reason other than your own prejudice. Mason's face paled. He opened his mouth to protest, but no words came out. He had no defense, no way to explain away the blatant racism that had driven his actions. Deep down, he knew he had gone too far. Captain Allen straightened up, towering over Mason. Take off your badge, Officer Mason, he said coldly. You're done. The words hit Mason like a punch to the gut. Wait, sir, please, it was a mistake. I didn't mean... No, Allen snapped. You meant exactly what you did. Now take off your badge and get out of my station. Mason hesitated, looking around for support, but none of his fellow officers came to his defense. Slowly, he reached up, unpinned his badge, and handed it over. Captain Allen took it without another word, his face a mask of disgust. Mason stood frozen as Captain Allen pocketed the badge, his mind racing. The full weight of his actions began to crash down on him, and he realized this wasn't just a slap on the wrist. His career, his reputation, everything was crumbling in front of him. Captain, please, Mason started, desperation creeping into his voice. I've been on the force for years. I can explain. Captain Allen held up a hand, cutting him off. You think I care about your years of service, Derek? You've been hiding behind that badge for too long, using it to enforce your own biased version of the law? But not today. Today you messed with the wrong person. You're done. Mason swallowed hard, but his pride wouldn't let him back down completely. So what? Just because she's your daughter, I get fired? Is that how it works? Alan's eyes flared, and he took a menacing step closer. You think this is about me? About Keisha? This is about the dozens of complaints I've had to brush under the rug because I hoped you were better than this. But today, you proved everyone right. Mason clenched his fists, his heart pounding. You don't understand, sir. It wasn't like that. I don't want to hear another word from you, Alan growled. He looked over his shoulder at the officers standing nearby, particularly Ramirez, who had been watching the entire confrontation unfold. Escort him out. Ramirez, always the one to follow the captain's orders without hesitation, stepped forward and nodded. Come on, Mason, she said, her voice firm but not without sympathy. She had seen Mason's behavior escalate over the years, but even she hadn't expected it to reach this point. Mason's face twisted with anger, and for a brief second, it seemed like he might resist. But with all eyes on him and his career hanging by a thread, he reluctantly followed Ramirez toward the door. The station watched in silence as Mason, once proud and cocky, now looked like a broken man. Keisha, still clinging to her father, watched them go, her small hand gripping Captain Allen's sleeve. Daddy, is he going to come back? She asked in a small, shaky voice. Allen knelt down beside her, brushing a tear from her cheek. No, baby, he's gone for good. No one's ever going to hurt you like that again. The station remained quiet, the tension still thick in the air. Ramirez returned after escorting Mason outside, her face grim. Captain, she began, what should we do about the rest of his cases? You know he's got a lot of arrests under his belt, and some of them might need to be revisited. Allen's jaw tightened. You're right, he said after a moment. I'll be looking into every single one of them. If Mason's been abusing his power like this, I'm not going to let his victims suffer any longer. Ramirez nodded, relieved to see the captain taking decisive action. But before she could say anything else, the door to the station burst open again, this time revealing the stern face of Lieutenant Brooks, the internal affairs officer. Brooks glanced at Captain Allen, then down at Keisha. His expression softened, but only for a moment. Captain, I heard what happened, he said, his voice steady. We need to talk about Mason and about the bigger picture. Allen sighed heavily, standing up straight. Yeah, he said. We do. Captain Allen gestured for Lieutenant Brooks to follow him into his office, the weight of the day pressing heavily on his shoulders. Keisha stood with Ramirez, still shaking but comforted by the officer's presence. Have a seat, Allen said, motioning to the chairs in his small office. The walls were adorned with photos of his time on the force, but the pride he usually felt looking at them was now overshadowed by the events of the day. Brooks settled into the chair opposite Allen, his expression serious. I received a call from the chief. He's not happy about Mason's actions or the fallout. This isn't just about him. It reflects on the whole department. Don't remind me, Allen replied, pinching the bridge of his nose in frustration. This isn't the first time Mason has crossed the line. I've had complaints about him for years, but I thought maybe he'd change. I thought I could manage him. Clearly that was a mistake, Brooks said, his tone steady but laced with concern. We need to look at every case he handled, especially the arrests involving black individuals. If we don't act, it will haunt us. Allen nodded, the anger boiling beneath the surface again. I'll go through his case files myself. If there's any indication of racial bias, those cases need to be reopened. I won't let anyone's life be ruined because of Mason's prejudice. Brooks leaned back, studying Allen's face. This is going to require more than just a review of paperwork. If we're going to clean house, we'll need solid evidence to support any claims. You know how internal affairs works. Allen's eyes hardened, the determination surging within him. I don't care. We have to do the right thing, and I'm going to make sure Mason faces the consequences of his actions. Meanwhile, Keisha, with Ramirez's gentle encouragement, began to relax. Can we go home now? she asked, her small voice breaking through the seriousness in the room. Ramirez knelt down to her level, her smile warm and reassuring. Yes, sweetie, your dad is going to take you home, and everything is going to be okay. No one is going to hurt you like that again, I promise. As Keisha's worry eased, Alan returned to his daughter, wrapping his arms around her once more. I'm so sorry you had to go through that, Keisha. I should have been there to protect you. Daddy, it's okay, she whispered, trying to reassure him. I wasn't scared when you came. I knew you'd save me. His heart swelled with pride, but the guilt still lingered. I won't let you down again, he vowed softly. With Keisha safe in his arms, Alan stepped back into the main area of the station, where the atmosphere was still tense. Officers exchanged glances, their expressions a mix of curiosity and apprehension. They'd all witnessed the confrontation, and now they were waiting to see how their captain would respond. Listen up, Alan's voice boomed, drawing the attention of everyone in the room. This department stands for justice every single day, but today one of our own failed that standard in a big way. Derek Mason is no longer with us, and we're going to take a long, hard look at the way we handle cases, especially those involving racial profiling. Whispers erupted throughout the station. What will happen to his cases? Is this going to go higher up? Do we have to worry about our own? The questions swirled, but Alan remained firm, his gaze steady. This isn't just about one officer, he continued, raising his voice to drown out the murmurs. This is about our duty to serve and protect. It's about every single person we come into contact with. We are better than this, and it's time to prove it. Keisha stood beside him, small but resolute, her wide eyes taking in the scene. Daddy, can I help? She piped up, her innocence a stark contrast to the weight of the conversation. Alan chuckled softly, a proud smile breaking through the tension. You just did, kiddo. You reminded us all what we're fighting for. The next few days were a whirlwind of activity at the station. Captain Allen's decision to re-examine Derek Mason's cases sent shockwaves through the department, forcing everyone to confront the uncomfortable reality that one of their own had been abusing his power for years. Each case file, arrest record, and complaint was reviewed with a new lens, looking for signs of racial bias or misconduct. The tension in the station was palpable. For Alan, it was an exhausting process, both emotionally and professionally. Every new discovery of a racially motivated arrest or mishandled case felt like another blow to the department's integrity. But he pushed forward, determined to clean up the mess Mason had left behind. Late one evening, after most of the station had emptied out, Ramirez entered Alan's office with a stack of files in her hands. Captain, you need to see this, she said, her voice heavy with concern. Alan looked up from his desk, his eyes red from lack of sleep. What is it? Ramirez handed over the files and sat down across from him. These are some of Mason's more recent arrests, and there's a pattern here, one that's hard to ignore. Alan flipped through the files, his expression darkening with each page. The names of black men and women filled the reports, many of them arrested on minor charges or based on flimsy evidence. In some cases, the charges seemed fabricated altogether. He was targeting black people, Ramirez continued, her voice grim. Specifically, and from what I can tell, he was doing it for a long time. Alan's hands tightened around the papers. He had suspected Mason's behavior had been bad, but this was worse than he imagined. How many lives did he ruin? He muttered under his breath, staring at the evidence. Ramirez hesitated. We don't know yet, but there's enough here to suggest that many of these arrests were racially motivated. If we don't take action soon, this is going to blow up in our faces. The weight of the situation was pressing down on him harder than ever. He knew he had to do something, but how could he repair the damage Mason had caused? How could he make things right for the people who had suffered? Just then, his phone buzzed on the desk. It was a text from Lieutenant Brooks asking to meet in the conference room. Alan sighed, rubbing his temples before standing up. I'll deal with this, he said, looking back at Ramirez. Keep digging into the files. I want every single one of Mason's cases re-examined, no matter how far back they go. Ramirez nodded, her expression resolute. Will do, Captain. Alan left his office and made his way to the conference room, where Brooks was already waiting. The internal affairs officer was seated at the head of the table, a series of documents spread out in front of him. "Captain?" Brooks greeted him, his tone serious as always. "We've got a situation." Allen sat down across from him, already bracing for the worst. "What now?" Brooks slid a folder across the table. "Mason isn't the only one. We found other officers with similar patterns in their arrests. This is bigger than just one bad cop." Allen's stomach sank as he opened the folder. Inside were names, reports, and statistics, evidence that other officers in the department had been engaging in the same discriminatory behavior as Mason. It was systemic. "Damn it," Allen whispered, his frustration boiling over. "How did this get so out of hand?" Brooks leaned forward, his expression grave. "It's been happening for years, Captain. Mason was just the tip of the iceberg. If we don't act fast, this whole department is going to be under fire. The public already has trust issues with law enforcement. This could be the final straw." Allen closed the folder, his mind racing. The problem was bigger than he'd anticipated, and now the department's reputation, and his own, was on the line. He had to find a way to restore the public's trust and clean up the force, but it wouldn't be easy. "We're going to fix this," Allen said firmly, though the doubt gnawed at him. "We'll root out every single officer involved and make sure justice is served." But even as he said it, he knew the road ahead would be long and difficult. The weight of responsibility felt heavier than ever. He'd already lost Mason, one of his own, and now it seemed like more officers were about to fall. But if that was what it took to protect his community, he was prepared to do it. Brooks gave a nod, his expression hard but supportive. "I'll help in any way I can." As they strategized late into the night, Allen couldn't shake the image of his daughter, innocent and trusting, out of his mind. Keisha had been at the center of this storm, but now she was also his motivation to ensure things changed for the better. The department would be cleansed of the rot Mason had spread, no matter how painful the process. Captain Allen arrived home late that night, exhaustion gripping every fiber of his body. Keisha was already asleep, curled up in her bed with her favorite stuffed bear tucked under her arm. He stood in the doorway for a moment, watching her peaceful slumber. Despite everything that had happened, seeing her safe and sound made the weight of the day a little lighter. But the image of Mason's face still lingered in his mind, as did the mounting evidence of other officers following in his corrupt footsteps. The department he had worked so hard to lead, to represent fairness and justice, was riddled with racism he hadn't seen, or perhaps hadn't wanted to see. Allen sighed, quietly closing Keisha's door and heading to the living room. His wife, Cynthia, was sitting on the couch waiting for him. Her face showed the same concern it had since the incident with Keisha. "You look like you haven't slept in days," Cynthia said softly, patting the space next to her. "Come sit." Allen slumped onto the couch beside her, his head leaning back as he closed his eyes. "It's been a nightmare at the station, Cynthia. I don't even know where to start. Everything feels like it's falling apart." Cynthia reached over, gently rubbing his arm. "I heard what happened with Mason. It's all over the news." "Yeah," he muttered, the frustration evident in his voice. "And it's not just him. There are other officers who were doing the same thing. Racist, targeting black people like our daughter. I never thought... God, how did I not see it?" Cynthia's hand stilled for a moment before she spoke. "It's not easy, Eddie. You've been in that department for so long. Maybe it was hard to believe people you worked with, people you trusted, could be capable of such things. But now that you know, you're doing the right thing." "I hope so," Allen said, running a hand through his hair. "I just want this to be over. I want to fix everything, but it's like I'm fighting a battle I can't win. The damage is done, and I keep thinking about Keisha, how she could have been hurt, or worse, because of Mason's hatred." Cynthia's voice softened. "But she wasn't. You saved her, Eddie. You were there for her when she needed you. And now you're making sure no one else gets hurt by the same people who let this happen." "I'm trying," he whispered, feeling the weight of responsibility crushing him. "But it's like walking through quicksand. The harder I try, the more I feel like I'm sinking." Cynthia cupped his face, gently turning his head to look at her. "You're not sinking. You're doing the right thing, and people will see that. But you can't do it alone. Let people help you. Don't carry this burden all by yourself. Alan looked into her eyes, finding solace in her unwavering support. He had always relied on her strength during tough times, and now was no different. I don't deserve you, you know that? He said with a small, tired smile. Cynthia laughed softly, kissing his forehead. You deserve more than you give yourself credit for. Just keep doing what you're doing. Keisha's proud of you, and so am I. Her words settled the storm of doubts in his mind, if only for a moment. He knew the fight wasn't over, but having her by his side made the load a little lighter. He stood up, taking her hand in his. I'm going to take a quick shower and try to get some sleep. Tomorrow's going to be another long day. Cynthia nodded, squeezing his hand. We'll get through this. As Alan stepped into the bathroom and let the hot water wash over him, his mind continued to race. What would happen when he returned to the station? What if more officers were implicated? How would the community react when they found out that the very people sworn to protect them had been working against them? He thought of Keisha, the way her innocent eyes had filled with fear when Mason had laid his hands on her. That fear would never leave him, and he would make sure no other black child in this city ever had to feel it again. When Alan finally collapsed into bed, exhaustion overtook him, but his mind remained restless. Tomorrow would bring more challenges, more difficult decisions. But he was ready. He had to be. The next morning, the station was already buzzing when Alan arrived. Ramirez was waiting for him at his office door, her expression serious but hopeful. Captain, you're going to want to see this. Alan frowned, following her to the conference room. Brooks was there, along with several other officers from the Internal Affairs. On the table in front of them were more files, evidence that Mason and others had not only been racially profiling black citizens, but had been actively manipulating reports to cover their tracks. This is it, Brooks said, sliding a report toward Alan. We've got enough to take this public. It's bigger than we thought. Alan scanned the papers, his anger simmering just beneath the surface. This was the proof he needed, but it felt hollow. So many lives had already been affected. What about the officers involved? Brooks crossed his arms, his face grim. They're being suspended pending investigation, but we'll need to make a statement, Captain. The public's going to demand answers, and they're going to want justice. Alan nodded slowly. The reckoning was coming, and there was no turning back now. Prepare the statement, he said. We'll face this head on. The press conference was packed. The station's briefing room had never been so full. Journalists, community leaders, concerned citizens, and even a few protesters filled every inch of space. Cameras flashed, microphones were ready, and the murmurs of the crowd were tense, expectant. Captain Allen stood at the podium, the weight of his responsibility pressing on his shoulders. Ramirez and Brooks flanked him, but the eyes of the room were fixed on Allen. He could feel the weight of their expectations, their anger, and their demand for justice. The department had betrayed them, and it was up to him to address the betrayal head-on. He cleared his throat, looking out at the sea of faces. Somewhere out there, his wife and Keisha were watching on television, waiting to see how he would handle this moment. Good morning, he began, his voice steady, though the gravity of the moment made his heart race. I stand before you today as both a captain of this police department and as a father whose daughter was nearly a victim of the very hatred we are sworn to fight. The room went silent. In recent days, we have uncovered disturbing evidence of racist behavior within our ranks. Certain officers, including those entrusted with protecting the city, have used their positions of power to target, intimidate, and manipulate black citizens, including children like my own daughter. I am deeply ashamed that this could happen under my watch. Allen paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. He saw the shock, the hurt, and the anger reflected in the faces before him. He continued, effective immediately, the officers involved in these incidents, including Sergeant Mason, have been suspended and will face a full investigation by both internal affairs and external agencies. This department will no longer tolerate hate, discrimination, or the abuse of power. Journalists raised their hands, eager to ask questions, but Allen pressed on. We owe it to our community to rebuild trust. To those who have been affected by the actions of these officers, I am sorry. I promise you that change is coming. This department will be held accountable, and I will ensure that those responsible for these injustices face the consequences of their actions." He stepped away from the podium, leaving the journalists in a frenzy, their questions blending into a cacophony. But Allen didn't stay to answer them. His focus wasn't on headlines, it was on action. Later that day, Allen sat in his office, the door closed as the storm outside raged. He looked at the report in front of him, the list of names. Officers he had worked with for years, some of whom he had considered friends. But they had betrayed his trust, betrayed the badge, and, most unforgivably, betrayed the people they were sworn to protect. He didn't feel relief. The battle was just beginning. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. "Come in," he called. The door opened, and Keisha peeked in, followed by Cynthia. "We wanted to check on you," Cynthia said, her voice gentle. Keisha ran over, climbing onto his lap. "Are you okay, Daddy?" she asked, looking up at him with wide eyes. Allen smiled, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "I will be, sweetheart. I will be." 2 months later, Mason was brought before the court. The evidence against him was overwhelming. His abuse of power, the racial profiling, and the wrongful arrests of black citizens were all laid bare. He tried to defend his actions, but the public had seen enough. His name was synonymous with corruption, and the community demanded accountability. As Allen watched from the back of the courtroom, Mason was sentenced to prison for his actions. The room erupted into cheers as the gavel struck, sealing Mason's fate. Justice had been served, and the corrupt officer would no longer be able to harm anyone. But it wasn't just Mason who faced consequences. The other officers involved in the cover-ups and discriminatory practices were also brought to trial. One by one, they were exposed and held accountable. The department, under Allen's leadership, had begun the slow and difficult process of rebuilding, starting with mandatory anti-bias training and a transparent investigation process. The city, while scarred, was healing. Community leaders worked with the department to implement reforms that would prevent future abuses. And while there was still much work to be done, Allen knew they were on the right path. Outside the courthouse, Keisha ran up to Allen, wrapping her arms around him. "You did it, Daddy!" she exclaimed, her face beaming with pride. Allen knelt down, hugging her tightly. "We did it," he whispered. "We made things right." He stood, taking Keisha's hand as they walked away from the courthouse. Cynthia joined them, linking arms with Allen. Together, they headed home, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead, stronger, united, and determined to build a future where justice and equality would prevail. The story of Mason and the others who abused their power had come to an end. But for Captain Allen, his fight to protect his community had only just begun.